On the freezing morning of January 12th, 1995, a convoy of heavy trucks crawled through a blinding blizzard into the remote, snow-choked heart of a legendary wilderness. The air was a bitter -20 degrees, so cold that every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. Inside the reinforced wooden crates strapped to the flatbeds, something extraordinary was waiting. 12 grey wolves, captured weeks prior in the rugged expanses of Western Canada, sat in absolute silence. For over 70 years, this vast national park had been a biological ghost town, a landscape stripped of its soul, silenced by human hands. The plan was as simple as it was controversial. Open the crates, let these 12 predators run free, and hope they could somehow survive in a crumbling ecosystem that had completely forgotten how to coexist with them. The odds were catastrophically low. Local ranchers predicted the wolves would starve within months. Politicians claimed they would wander past the park borders and be wiped out immediately. Even the scientists holding the release keys feared these 12 lonely animals would succumb to the brutal winter or the hostility of an unfamiliar terrain. Everyone braced for a tragic, expensive failure. But that's not what happened. The moment those wooden doors slid open, a biological chain reaction was triggered that completely defied every law of modern ecology. What actually happened over the next 3 decades did not just save a dying ecosystem, it literally rewrote the physical geography of the Earth itself, forcing humanity to rethink everything we thought we knew about the natural world. This is the story of how 12 individuals repaired a broken wilderness. First, we will uncover the dark history of how this great park was systematically emptied of its life force, transforming a paradise into a barren wasteland. Then, we will step inside the high-stakes secret mission to bring the world's most feared predator back from the dead. And finally, we will look at the stunning, irreversible transformation that left the global scientific community completely speechless. If you think this is just a story about a predator catching its prey, you are about to discover something far deeper. To understand the magnitude of what occurred, you have to look past the myths and see the grey wolf for what it truly is. It is not just a hunter, it is an architect. For thousands of years, Canis lupus evolved alongside this landscape, shaping its rhythm, its safety, and its very identity. Weighing up to 140 pounds, with jaw muscles capable of exerting a crushing pressure of over 400 pounds per square inch, nearly twice that of a large German shepherd, the wolf is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. Their bodies are built for the long, agonizing marathon of the northern winter. A specialized circulatory system in their paws keeps their pads just above freezing, preventing tissue damage as they run across sheets of jagged ice. Their eyes contain a thick layer of a reflective tissue called the tapetum lucidum, which amplifies the faintest glimmers of starlight, allowing them to hunt in absolute darkness. But their true power does not lie in their teeth or their speed, it lies in their minds. Wolves operate within highly sophisticated, deeply emotional family units. They do not live in chaotic, tyrannical hierarchies ruled by brutal force. They live in structured societies built on trust, collective grief, and shared knowledge. A pack learns together, mourns its dead, and passes down hunting traditions from one generation to the next. They possess an uncanny ability to read the subtle vulnerabilities of a landscape, recognizing which valley holds an escape route and which ridge offers a tactical advantage. For millennia, this deep intelligence kept the entire ecosystem in a state of perfect, vibrant equilibrium. Then, humanity stepped in, and everything shattered. By the mid-1930s, a systematic, government-sanctioned eradication campaign had achieved its horrific goal. Viewed as bloodthirsty monsters and agricultural pests, wolves were hunted with a terrifying industrial ferocity. They were poisoned with strychnine, trapped in agonizing iron jaws, and shot from the air. In a matter of a few short decades, the last remaining wolves in the park were executed. The silence that followed was deafening. With the apex predator completely gone, a catastrophic cascade effect tore through the environment. It began with the elk. Without the constant, watchful threat of the wolves, the elk population exploded to unnatural, unsustainable numbers. They stopped moving. They no longer had to hide in the deep forests or stay alert on the high ridges. Instead, they settled into the fertile river valleys, transforming into heavy, lazy grazers. They ate everything in sight. Millions of young willow trees, cottonwoods, and aspens were systematically devoured before they could even take root. Entire forests stopped regenerating. For over half a century, not a single new tree grew to maturity along the river corridors. The loss of the trees triggered a massive, compounding ecological disaster. Without willow and aspen bark, the beaver populations starved and vanished completely. Without beaver dams to slow the flow of water, the rivers transformed. They became violent, fast-moving torrents during the spring melts, tearing away at the unprotected soil. The riverbanks, no longer anchored by the deep, strong roots of trees, collapsed into the water. Deep, cool pools turned into wide, shallow, muddy channels. The water temperature skyrocketed, suffocating the native trout populations. The songbirds, losing their nesting habitats in the willow thickets, fell silent. The valley floors dried up, turning into arid, dusty plains. The very earth was washing away, and the park was dying a slow, agonizing death from the inside out. It seemed entirely hopeless, a permanent monument to human arrogance. But then came the lucky turn. In the late 1980s, a small group of visionary biologists looking at the barren, eroded valleys of the park noticed something that looked wrong in the best way possible. They realized that while the landscape looked completely dead, the underlying blueprint of the ecosystem was still intact. The soil was still fertile, the water still flowed. All that was missing was the pulse. A fierce, bitter debate erupted across the nation. Ranchers screamed that releasing wolves would ruin their livelihoods, claiming the predators would massacre livestock and terrorize local communities. Politicians threatened to defund the entire wildlife department. But the scientists held their ground, arguing that without the wolf, the park would soon face total ecological collapse. The decision was finally made to execute a high-risk, logistically agonizing reintroduction program. It felt less like a wildlife relocation and more like a covert military operation. Teams of expert trackers traveled into the dense wilderness of Alberta, Canada, carefully capturing 12 wolves from healthy, wild packs. Every detail had to be perfect. They couldn't just take any wolves. They needed a balanced mix of ages, alpha pairings, and genetic diversity. The animals were sedated, loaded into specialized transport crates, and flown across international borders under the cover of winter, keeping them cool and minimizing their stress. Which brings us back to that unforgettable morning in January 1995. As the heavy wooden crates were lowered onto the snow, the researchers held their breath. They knew that if these 12 animals ran the wrong way, if they failed to hunt, or if they were shot the moment they crossed the park boundaries, the dream of rewilding would be buried forever. With a sharp creak, the doors were lifted. The initial response from the wolves was cautious, almost hesitant. They stepped out into the crisp, biting air, their paws sinking into the deep powder of a land their ancestors had ruled for thousands of years. They sniffed the freezing wind, testing the unfamiliar sense of a forgotten kingdom. Within days, the 12 wolves formed small packs and began to do what they were born to do. They started to hunt. The threats they faced were immediate and severe. The winter was one of the harshest on record. An elite population of massive, aggressive grizzly bears challenged them for territory, and a sudden outbreak of a deadly canine virus threatened to wipe out the small group before they could even establish a foothold. The dangers were terrifyingly real, but they were never the headline. The headline was how rapidly and how profoundly the natural world responded to their presence. The wolves did something completely unexpected. They did not just kill the elk, they changed the elk's behavior. This phenomenon, known to science as the ecology of fear, transformed the park almost overnight. The elk realized that if they lingered in the deep valleys, enclosed by steep riverbanks and thick gorges, they were trapped. Their ancient instincts woke up. They stopped grazing lazily in the open fields. They moved up to the high, wind-swept ridges, where they had clear lines of sight and multiple escape routes. The moment the elk abandoned the valleys, the land began to breathe. In those protected areas, the vegetation did something miraculous. It exploded. Areas that had been bare mud and dust for 70 years suddenly saw willow trees shoot up to 15 feet in height in less than a decade. The aspen forests began to march down the hillsides once again, their pale bark gleaming in the sunlight. And then the ripples of life spread further. Because the willows and cottonwoods returned, a single solitary beaver wandered into the park from a distant tributary, found the abundant wood, and built a dam. Within a few years, those dams multiplied. The beavers, the ultimate eco-engineers, created vast networks of wetlands and ponds. These new water sanctuaries became home to ducks, geese, muskrats, otters, and amphibians. The deep roots of the regenerating trees anchored the soil, preventing erosion and stabilizing the riverbanks. The water grew cooler and clearer, and the trout populations surged. The songbirds returned by the thousands, their melodies echoing through valleys that had been silent for 3 generations. The numbers tell a story of staggering, triumphant growth. From those original 12 pioneers in 1995, the population grew steadily. By the year 2000, there were over 50 wolves operating in the park. By 2010, that number had stabilized to around 150 individuals, divided into several highly organized packs. Today, the population remains healthy and balanced, fluctuating naturally based on the availability of prey. To put the scale of this comeback into perspective, the wolves expanded their territory across an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, a massive, self-sustaining sanctuary where humans have completely stepped back, allowing the apex predator to run the show entirely on its own terms. The economic and social impact on the surrounding human communities was equally profound. The dying, isolated rural towns bordering the park experienced an unprecedented economic renaissance. Over $40 million in annual ecotourism revenue flooded into the local economy, creating hundreds of jobs for wildlife guides, hotel owners, and restaurateurs. People traveled from every corner of the globe just to catch a fleeting glimpse of a grey silhouette moving across a distant ridge. But as scientists monitored this incredible recovery, they noticed something strange, something that defied every conventional rule of biology. It was a detail that had been overlooked, a subtle shift in the landscape that everyone had initially dismissed as a fluke. It led to a twist that completely stunned the scientific community. Nobody thought a predator could alter the physical geology of the Earth. Scientists assumed that while wolves could control animal populations, the physical terrain, the dirt, the stone, the paths of the water, was governed strictly by climate, gravity, and time. They were completely wrong. When researchers began analyzing aerial satellite photography of the park across multiple decades, they discovered that the actual shape of the rivers had changed. The rivers stopped meandering wildly. They stopped cutting destructive, unpredictable paths through the valley floors and washing away massive chunks of land. Instead, the river channels narrowed. They became deeper, more direct, and established fixed, stable courses. The wolves had literally altered the physical geography of the national park. By forcing the elk out of the valleys, allowing the trees to grow, and enabling the beavers to build their dams, the wolves had created a biological matrix that locked the earth into place. The roots of the new forests acted like massive, living, subterranean anchors, binding the soil together so tightly that the rushing water could no longer tear the banks apart. A predator had transformed the physical flow of water across the continent. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through institutions worldwide. In a landmark study published in the prestigious journal Ecological Monographs, researchers conclusively proved that the reintroduction of the wolf had initiated a top-down trophic cascade so powerful that it altered both the biological and physical properties of the wilderness. The science was undeniable, rigorous, and absolute. Yet the deepest peak of this journey wasn't found in a datasheet or a scientific journal. It was found in the cultural memory of the land itself. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of the region had lived in perfect harmony with the wolf, viewing them not as enemies, but as sacred teachers and older brothers. When the wolves were wiped out in the 1930s, an elder from a local tribe noted that a profound piece of their own cultural identity had been torn away. Their ancient songs, passed down through generations, spoke of a time when the valleys were green, the waters were clear, and the voice of the wolf kept the world awake. For 70 years, those stories felt like distant myths. On a quiet, starlit evening shortly after the release, an elderly tribal member stood at the edge of the park boundary with his grandson. The air was perfectly still. Suddenly, cutting through the freezing darkness, came a sound that had not been heard in that valley for nearly a century. A long, low, haunting howl echoed off the granite cliffs, rising in pitch before being joined by another, and then another, until the entire night sky seemed to vibrate with the music of the pack. The elder closed his eyes, tears freezing on his cheeks, and whispered to his grandson that the land was finally whole again. The memory had survived, and now the truth had returned. This breathtaking journey reminds us of a fundamental truth that humanity so often forgets. From 12 lonely wolves in a dying, silent landscape to a thriving, vibrant Eden that rewrote the very paths of its rivers, we are reminded of our true place in the natural order. We didn't restore the valley, we simply returned the animal that knew how. This single story has sparked a global rewilding movement, inspiring nations across Europe, South America and Africa to bring back their own lost giants, from apex predators to mega herbivores, proving that nature possesses an infinite, miraculous capacity to heal if we just have the courage to step out of the way. What do you think about the power of rewilding? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more incredible stories of nature's greatest comebacks, make sure to hit that share button, like this video and subscribe to the channel. The future of our wild spaces depends on the stories we choose to tell and the predators we choose to protect.